Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Well, tonight in Manila, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining the U.S. election, digging into disinformation. This is the second of two GIJN webinars on the upcoming U.S. elections. So the U.S. elections are, gosh, less than a month away right now, and the stakes for America and the rest of the world are enormous. The focus today will be looking at the information we get and the disinformation that is turning everything upside down. My name is Maria Ressa. I'm the executive editor of Rappler in the Philippines. I've been a journalist for almost 35 years now, and I know firsthand what disinformation can do and why we need to do something about it. The US election campaigns, they're taking place in the middle of the worst pandemic. This you already know. It is the most acute economic crisis since the Depression, growing inequality, the conflict, anti-racist protests. It's become an information war, a billion-dollar battlefield marked by unverified, misleading, and false information involving not just Americans, non-American players alike. Although the news media itself is under attack, we know this, journalists play a critical role in reporting and in investigating this election. Understanding and investigating disinformation is central to everything that's going to happen next. Again, let me introduce the experts and friends who are here. I'm actually really excited. So thank you, GIJN, for putting us all together. They have been working at this field from the very beginning. And what I find interesting is the three people you're going to talk to represent the three parts that are I call them the stools, the legs of the stool that holds up democracy: technology, journalism for the facts, and then civil society to actually act, right? Up front, is tech. Camille François is the Chief Innovation Officer at Graphika, where she leads that company's work to detect and mitigate disinformation, media manipulation, and harassment. Camille was previously principal researcher at Jigsaw. It's an innovation unit at Google. It builds technology that addresses these global security challenges and protects the vulnerable users. That was where I first met her, and she was leading the research then. She's advised governments, parliamentary committees on policy issues related to cybersecurity and digital rights. The journalist, Craig Silverman, is award-winning. We all know his work. He's an expert on online disinformation, misinformation, fake news, content verification. He's the media editor of BuzzFeed News, where he leads a global team that covers platforms, online misinformation, and media manipulation. Craig was named to the Political 50 for his work exposing fake news and its effect on American politics. He edited the Verification Handbook and the Verification Handbook for Investigative Reporting, also the author of the award-winning book, Mafia Boy. And then last but not least, Claire Wardle. She is at the forefront of a lot of the work that we're all doing now as well. She's an expert on user-generated content verification, executive chair of First Draft. It's a nonprofit dedicated to educating journalists about reporting in an age of this dystopia. The information ecosystem turned upside down. First Draft has led pioneering work around combating disinformation during elections in many countries around the world. She's also co-author of Information Disorder Toward an Interdisciplinary Framework for Research and Policymaking. That's a report for the Council of Europe. It's really good to see all of you. Let's go to the tech. Camille, I forgot to tell you, she's also, I'm going to get this right, one of the MIT's 35 under 35 and also a Time 100. All right, I'll shut up, Camille, and let me toss it to you. We're walking into elections. You've been doing this a long time. What is different? What do we need to be prepared for?
Yeah, that's a great question. What is different? I think we can start with what is different from last time around in the 2016 US election. And I think the answer is a lot is different. Maria, as you know better than anybody else, for people who are working on disinformation and coordinated harassment campaign, troll farms, and all that, 2016 was not a good year. Most of the research on this topic tended to be marginalized. Most of the large platforms didn't really care. There wasn't really even terms of services that prevented this type of activity, and nobody was really in charge of investigating any of that. It would have never been considered a national security issue. And all of this, I think, really changed in 2017 with the reckoning in the face of the Russian campaign targeting the US election. Since then, we've done a long way. They are now real policies that prevent this type of manipulation. There are now real teams that are in charge of detecting it. There's a recognition that this does happen. I don't mean to say that it's perfect by any means. I still think we have a long way to go, but it's a radically different environment because A, we acknowledge the problem, B, there are people in charge of solving it, although, you know, of course, there's still things they're missing, and C, now there are actual policies that you can apply. Now, that being said, there are a few things that I think we still unfortunately see. I think one of the most interesting cases is that of Russian interference. To date, I have seen at least 5 different Russian campaigns targeting directly the US election. We wrote a report on each of them. The first one that we saw started in October of 2019. And it used Instagram this time to really just target the same audiences that Russia targeted in 2016. And since that first campaign in October 2019, we've seen at least 4 others. 3 of them we wrote about last week, or in the last 10 days. It was a sort of hectic moment. And here you see again, like the same overall strategic targeting at play, right? So messaging that's designed to divide audiences, messaging that's targeting sort of both parts of the spectrum and where Russia considers the extremes to be, anti-Biden messaging. We do see pro-Trump messaging. We do see this being done in a new way, right? So there are definitely things in 2020 that were not there in 2016. The use of AI to generate, for instance, fake profile pictures is definitely something that we've seen a lot in 2020 that we hadn't seen in 2016. And the other trend that's close to my heart and a bit worrisome is in 2020, a lot of the last campaigns we've seen are really targeting unwitting participants, sometimes unwitting journalists, right? So there were 2 examples of 2 websites that pretended to be independent news websites, and that were actually Russian operations meant to target and divide American society. And what they did is, at first they were simply like stealing other people's works and articles and just putting them in the website. And then eventually they decided like, actually, we're gonna do our own thing. They wrote their own articles, they were terrible. And then they realized like, actually, journalists write better articles than trolls, which of course was right. And then they started sort of like recruiting unwitting participants to have real American people write articles on behalf of Russian operations. So that's just for the Russia piece. And I know I want to have like a more dynamic discussion, but let me just also acknowledge that the big thing that changed in 2020 that we didn't have in 2016 is a recognition that this landscape is much bigger than Russia. We've also seen at least 2 Chinese campaigns targeting the US 2020 election directly, and a few Iranian campaigns too. And that is just if you focus on the foreign actors. There's of course quite a bit that's actually coming from the domestic political scape. And there's this entire universe of financially motivated disinformation. That's something that Craig investigated quite a bit. I don't know how he keeps that patience, because the thing that he talked about in 2016 came back again in 2018. He had to write about this again, and we see them again coming back in 2020. So this is sort of like, something that we have to live with. So it's overall a more complex landscape.
And Camille, in terms of, you said they came back to target the same things, these networks kind of came back, but what impact does that have on people, right? Because while you have fake accounts doing these things, the people they're targeting are similar. What impact does that have? And then how does it play out in society?
Yeah, the good news is we've gotten much better at detection. it's really a collective endeavor. It's really interesting to see like where do these campaigns come from and how they get detected. I'll give you 3 different examples. The Peace Data website, right, which was a fake, it's a website that was run by Russia pretending to be an independent news organization. This, the FBI found it and told the platforms about it. Other example, a campaign that we call Double Deceit, which was run by the IRA in Ghana with unwitting activists doing Black Lives Matter and Black History Month post in Instagram. This actually came from the research of 2 professors at Clemson University who worked hand in hand with investigative journalists at CNN, came in Ghana on the ground to sort of uncover the operation. And finally, a 3rd example, what we recently documented, NAEBC, which was another sort of fake website that pretended to be a news organization, that came through the research of Reuters. So again, investigative journalism, right? So there's also this great variety of where the leads and these investigations come from. Because there are more eyes on this, because we have a better ability to work together, those operations get detected generally before they have time to build a significant audience, which is good news, right? Because if you compare this with the original IRA, by the time people caught up and decided that those accounts really shouldn't be online, they had like loads of followers and they had been active for 3 years. And the good news is like now we tend to be much quicker on detecting operations, and we're able to detect them before they have much more of an impact. It is, however, often distressing for the people who are targeted. I think that not only for the unwitting freelancers, there's a lot to unpack, and sort of waking up and realizing that you've participated in a Russian operation. The fact that the topic is getting hyper polarized is not helping, right? I think that foreign interference becoming a very polarized and contested space is really not helping the people who are targeted. It's also not helping the people who need to continue working on these issues. Yeah, I'll leave it here, but happy to talk more about this together.
Great. The last one before we go to our journal to Craig is, you know, one of the things I liked about the work you did is you looked at gendered disinformation, right? How has it changed? I mean, at a certain, you were the first person to really zoom me in on that. So what's happened with that? Has it gotten better or worse?
It's great. In 2020, we no longer have sexism on the internet, and that feels great. No, I'm kidding. You know, yes, I think it's important to highlight that sexism and sexist attack do remain a core of some of the specifically like targeted disinformation attacks. And we continue to see this around the world. We continue to see, for instance, state-sponsored coordinated harassment campaign who target women journalists, women activists, women politicians. And unfortunately, the fact that they use hyper-gendered language or hyper-gendered attacks helps them be more viral. It's unfortunate that, unfortunately, you know, sexist attacks tend to be viral online. I think overall we are a little bit, again, like collectively better at understanding that this is an issue and needs to be remediated with great speed. But this remains, unfortunately, constant of information operations who target who target political figures or journalists like you, Maria. Unfortunately, you know this better than anybody.
Yeah. Alan says you made him spit his coffee. He laughed so hard. You almost let's go to the fact, the guy who holds the facts, Craig. Thank you, Camille. We'll come back. Craig, you know, moving in less than a month before elections, what has changed? What have you focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things that has, I don't know if it's sort of changed from 2016, but it's gotten much worse, is that one of the notable things about 2016 was you had a presidential candidate at the time who was really embracing and pushing conspiracies. And you had an elevation of these alternative reality ecosystems online, trolls and other people who usually would be kind of off in the corners and the shadows. The Trump campaign in 2016 really elevated them and echoed them. And so here we are 4 years later, and that kind of thinking and that kind of content and that kind of, you know, those kinds of online attacks I mean, that has become part of the infrastructure of the ecosystem in the US information, world. And so that is one of the things that we've been sort of dealing with for the last 4 years plus, I guess. And now we're in the middle of an election, and the election, it's unbelievably like it's even kind of crazier than things felt in 2016 in some ways, when that felt like it was a high watermark, and it was. So, I mean, one of the things that stands out for me is in spite of the fact that, as Camille outlined, people have started to get their act together in terms of recognizing the problem, trying to combat it. There are way more people focused on this issue now than there were in 2016. There was a small group of us nerds who cared about it. And now there's tons of nerds, and that's great. But it's also, I mean, it's a little bit sad and depressing that, I think some things have improved, but it's still a really tough slog right now. And I think a positive thing with newsrooms and journalists is, there weren't so many disinformation reporters 4 years ago. Newsrooms understood far less about this. We have way more people on this beat. And I think the IQ of newsrooms has started to edge up a little bit, which is really important. But we also still have to kind of reckon with the usually unintended role that we play in sometimes amplifying these campaigns. We know we're targeted by them to get us to spread the stuff, but also to kind of go after journalists and delegitimize us. And so we have this, I don't know if it's kind of a paradox of, yes, we have to skill up, we have to be aware of it, we have to work hard and really try and push back against, the creeping dominance of these alternative reality systems. But we also have to be aware of, our faults and the way we sometimes play into this stuff. And it's a hard balance to strike. And sometimes it's, I marvel at the amount of disinformation reporters we have right now, and it's wonderful, but it's also like, it's the journalistic competitive thing where, well, I know there's 10 other reporters who might be looking at this, so I'm just going to tweet everything I see about QAnon or something like that. And I start to worry a little bit that the competitive nature of journalists sometimes works against us.
What things, if you are working on disinformation now, right? Because I think it's got to be part of everything that we do to give the facts. What kinds of lessons have you learned that we should have?
Yeah, well, so I did a couple slides here. I'm sorry, I'm a keener. And so let me share these, just really tips oriented. GIJN loves tip sheets. So I put together just 2 slides here, and we'll obviously make these available. So don't worry that you have to sort of write everything down or what have you. So on the first slide, like for me, these are some of the fundamental things you want to think about in terms of approaches. And the starting point is you have to find out where sort of the bad actors and where this stuff is originating. And then you need to watch and monitor. This can't be just sort of like a dipping in and dipping out kind of thing. You need to really spend some time, whether that's building Twitter lists, whether that's building lists of websites you can check regularly, maybe using tools like BuzzSumo, which can show you the top performing content. Get access to CrowdTangle, which is an amazing tool for monitoring groups and Facebook pages and Instagram accounts, as well as Reddit. And do this on an ongoing basis. Build up your lists, build up those things that you can look at. And so you want to be doing that monitoring, and you want to be paying attention to not just the actual kind of products themselves, whether they're Twitter accounts or Facebook pages, but like who are the people behind them? Who are the funders? Who are the organizations that actually help push this stuff forward even more? So you want to sort of feel like you're getting your arms around what this world looks like related to your beat or the place you're based in. There are a lot of tools out there. Some, cost money, but there's a lot of really good free ones. CrowdTangle, which is owned by Facebook and does give access to journalists, is a great free tool, but you need to get access to that. And a lot of times the tools we're using are not really built for journalists. They're built for security researchers or marketers, like I mentioned, BuzzSumo. And so I think you do have to have a little bit of familiarity with this stuff, but it doesn't outweigh the traditional reporting techniques and approaches. You can't have a tool do all the work for you. They just help you see things. They help you analyze things, but it's still up to you to make decisions. It's still up to you to practice verification. And it's still up to you to combine that stuff you're seeing on platforms with sources and other kinds of traditional reporting. So don't overlook that, is one of the things I really emphasize to people. And in terms of the approach, a lot of times you might see one thing Maybe it's one false claim or, something, and you want to see if other people are sort of spreading the same kind of information. And then you kind of pivot from that and you look, well, can I search and find other examples of this? Are there other accounts sharing this same meme or what have you? And so you start from one thing and you kind of try to build out the network, because we always want to understand, the spread, the impact, and also the magnitude of a particular piece of information. Is it part of a campaign or is it a single isolated thing? I do really emphasize the importance of collaboration within your newsroom. You might have a specialist, but I think everybody needs to kind of up their IQ on this. And you also need to realize that this basically impacts every beat. So, team up with science reporters, team up with health reporters, of course, political reporters and others. There's lots of stuff to go after. And then one of the, the last two things here, which are really important elements. The first thing is, I think it's not just enough to do the basic debunk. As much as possible, I think we need to create a cost, a toll for the people who are spreading false and misleading information, who are actively trying to degrade the information environment. So you need to be able to figure out who's behind it as much as possible. That being said, attribution is hard. You need to be careful. And especially if you're trying to attribute something to a state-based actor, everybody wants to say it's Russia, which, sometimes takes their eye off the ball domestically. You need to be really careful about attribution and talk to as many experts in this area, reach out to Camille and her team, or reach out to Claire and her team before you go out on a limb like that. And the last thing, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is, journalists are targeted with this stuff. So one, we're targeted because people want us to spread a false or misleading claim, which helps it get more eyeballs and also accrues credibility. And then the other thing is that, they want us to waste our time on this stuff occasionally. And so you really have to think about that threshold of when something has reached enough people, is maybe your audience has been exposed to it, that you actually want to go out there and talk about it. Tweeting every conspiracy you see is potentially just giving it more exposure. So really think about that. And then the last thing here is just, I made up a list of, some of the names of tools that are really commonly used by reporters on this beat, for you to check these things out. A lot of these, most of the ones that I've shown here are either free or have a useful free version. So even if you don't have budget, this is stuff that you can use. And then I also have links to a few resources here. I maintain a Google Doc of lots of links to tools and other tips and things like that for doing work in this area. That's the first bit.ly. Then earlier this year, we published the verification handbook for disinformation and media manipulation. We have a link there. Claire wrote a chapter about investigating messaging apps and also a kind of introductory chapter. We also had one of Camille's colleagues from Graphika, Ben Nimmo, do a case study, or rather a chapter. And then there's, a great list of tools from Bellingcat, especially if you're interested in cool geolocation stuff. And a nice website. This is not a journalist website. This is people who are investigators in the open source intelligence community. They have lots of tips and resources, and they do a regular podcast as well. So obviously these slides will be available to everyone. So don't worry if you didn't write it all down. But hopefully that's, some helpful kind of top line guidance and advice that is good for people, and they can actually make use of it and start to do some of this stuff, because it is like anything else. You got to practice, spend time monitoring, spend time working on it, and over time you'll start to see more connections.
Fantastic, fantastic. We're seeing lots of questions there. Please keep throwing your questions in. Eunice Au will be collecting all of them, and then after we go through a short Q&A, she'll come in and give us your questions and throw it to our panelists. Let's go to a really critical person, the leg of the stool, Claire Wardle. You have been doing this since the beginning, I think, right? I mean, I briefly remember meeting you when you were still with BBC, doing verification of user content, and then first draft came along. What's changed? Why is this time right before U.S. elections so important?
So, so wonderful to be on this this webinar with everybody. Such good friends. I wish we were all in the same room. But yes, you're right, Maria. I've been doing this since 2009 when I designed a training course for the BBC, and it was just this weird niche research topic that I had, which is how do people work out what's true online? And that weird niche thing has become the thing that everybody now realizes is a problem. The difference is scale. I mean, I remember back in 2009, I mean, you remember this too, Craig, but there was like a couple of hoaxsters that would do things like create a account that looked like the Pope, who would say, I mean, there was the yes men type hoaxster type stuff, but it was very rare. And journalists were like, yeah, we get it. We have PR, we have press releases, we have to be careful about sources. But it didn't seem, I mean, today, the kind of things that we'd see over a year, we see in the first hour of waking up. So it's the scale that's different. And I think exactly everything that Craig is saying, it's the deliberate targeting of journalists and taking the paradigm that journalists have, which is more sunlight is a disinfectant, and using it against the news media, which is most of these people who are trying to push this content either for financial or social or psychological reasons. They're doing it, but they don't have an audience. So they really are absolutely desperate for influencers or politicians or the news media to parrot what they want to push out. And I think that's very difficult for the news media to work their way through. And the other difference, it's not just that we have more domestic disinformation in the US now, we have more politicians pushing it. And that is incredibly difficult for the news media to work through. So there's one thing to say, okay, we're not going to report on that conspiracy. It's a very different thing to say, we're not actually going to report on that tweet from a president. And that's, I think those conversations are happening on an hourly basis in newsrooms today.
And it's happening everywhere around the world, right? I mean, so this particular elections, you know, since scale has scaled, and facts really have become debatable. We've seen society splintered apart. How should we be thinking about this and dealing with it?
So I think my great sadness is over the last 4 years, there has been an awareness raising campaign, but I don't think anybody has really taken the role of the citizens seriously. And quite right, the platforms have huge responsibility here. But I think there's been this sense of, well, if we can just get Facebook to tweak its algorithm, if we can just do that. And whenever we would talk about media literacy, there was this sense of like, oh, that's going to take too long. Let's not focus on that. But the truth is, we're about to go into a huge election in the US, and most Americans and most people around the world have not really been taught the tactics and techniques. So my slight frustration is we focus on content and we talk about fact checking and we sort of play whack-a-mole on individual pieces of content. What we have failed to do is really explain to people that they are wading through information streams every day that are polluted. This is why they are polluted. And these are ways that they can protect themselves and their communities. And I think we just haven't caught up to the methods that are used by those people who are trying to push this stuff. You know, what's the number one method of a bad actor? It's a screenshot, it's a meme, it's a visual. We've kind of got obsessed with, let's teach people how to read a headline. And actually we failed to say, look at this stuff that's appearing on your 13-year-old's Instagram feed. Take seriously the stuff that your conspiratorial uncle shares via email, which I don't think we've had the necessary conversations as societies about the impact that this kind of information is having on us. And I don't think we've talked about harm enough. And I think there's been a sense of like, oh, political disinformation, it's the Russians, it's the politicians, as opposed to, and we've seen this with COVID, this stuff, it can be incredibly harmful. And also it's less about changing people's minds, it's about dividing societies. And I mean, you know this, Maria, we've been talking about this, but to see what has happened in the last 3 years in the US, and I look back at some of my writings from 2017, and it seems like a quaint stroll through Disneyland in comparison to where we are now. And I think some of us would kind of warn about it, but we've got here really, really quickly.
So let me throw this to the three of you guys. I say this all the time. If we don't have integrity of facts, how can we have integrity of elections? And I guess I'll shift you. I'll jump off of what you said, Claire, which is, so how ready are Americans for elections, especially if they don't get the facts or if their facts are different, or, I watch the debates now and I just go, oh my God, how ready are Americans for elections, guys, given that a tainted information ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, they're not ready because by having a divided public, I mean, we saw this, I mean, I don't know how many people watched the vice presidential debate, but depending on what side of the fence you are, that's how you read the debate. And whatever event, that's how people see it. And so I think this idea, we love Camille's shirt, like, yes, facts, there are facts, is the earth round. But on a lot of this, it's there's a way of taking a fact and, you know, warping it and creating a different narrative structure around the fact. And I think those of us in the quality information ecosystem are not very good with dealing with that. We're like, facts, 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 as opposed to, hang on, how is that information being used and warped and framed? And that's difficult and different. So that's my 2 penny.
Craig, how would journalists deal with that? Oh, wait, Camille, you unplugged. You first then.
I was just going to add on what Claire is saying. I think it's true that for a long time we've been very focused on content, right? Like, is the content good content or bad content? Is it true content or is it false content? And, you know, the way we look about it, it's not just content that can be targeted and manipulated. It's also who's behind it, right? Like, if a website pretends to be a website run by Americans for Americans, and it's actually a money-making operation run from a Macedonian city, well, that's actually some form of a problem. It's had nothing to do with like whether or not it's true. Similarly, like behavior is a problem, right? Like perhaps the content that's being circulated isn't just wrong on its face, but like the fact that it's so inorganically amplified, the fact that people have used a series of techniques to make it look like it's a big grassroots movement, but in fact, it's just a bunch of kids who are, you know, pretending to have big virality, and really you're getting manipulated from a behavioral perspective is also quite important. So it's not just content, right? Like we tend to use this framework called the ABC framework. It's like, who's the actor behind it? How's the behavior being manipulated? And then there's a content problem too, but it's sort of like a whole range of different ways in which you can manipulate the information behavior. Craig, sorry, over to you, Craig.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really important points that, and this is where I think the conversation in journalism around fact checking, it becomes problematic, because, you know, people will often ask me, well, you know, does fact checking actually work? And when they're asking it, what they're really asking is, you know, will fact checking change someone's mind and remove false information from their brain and implant it with correct information? And the answer to that in a lot of cases is no, it won't do that. And if that's what we expect from fact checking and from journalists, we're going to be very disappointed. And so I do think that this idea of helping do work that, yes, provides accountability for not only prominent people spreading false information, but also for actors engaged in different types of manipulation of the information environment. Providing that accountability, exposing that is important. And then there's another piece of that is also like, how do we help build resilience among our audience? And so part of that is transparency, which is good for building trust, but also if we're transparent about how we went about revealing and finding this information so that it's there for people to read, maybe over time that helps them sort of identify ways that they can do this on their own. And so, you know, that element of the media literacy piece, again, it's not a silver bullet, just like fact checking is not a silver bullet, but we have to understand and recognize the complexity of the problem, and that our jobs as journalists is about more than just fact checking. Fact checking has value, can be a deterrent, does provide a public record. These are all good, useful things, but changing people's minds is not really our job here, right? And so I think we want to increase the quality of the information environment, build resilience, and help equip audiences to navigate what is admittedly a very chaotic, very different information environment that has only gotten worse in many ways over the last few years. And so I think for journalists, like, let's not get too obsessed with fact checking. Let's think about verification, but let's also think about broader ways that we can actually serve our audience.
So one of the things that's interesting to me is that the civil society journalists, we tend to think in terms of talk, like kind of more frontal thinking, but the platforms where our content rides, and the word that's always used is they optimize, they actually look at behavior and how to use the latest technology to keep us on their site, they look at our behavior and create a feedback loop with the tech. So let me be more specific. I've now gone as far as saying that social media platforms which deliver the news, which give the facts, is now a behavior modification system. right? Because the tech, we put our data in, there is a machine learning that will build a model of each of us that will know you better than you know yourself. And then your vulnerable moment to a message is sold to an advertiser, whether that is a company or a country or anyone who wants to pay to modify your behavior. I mean, this to me is not the way we journalists used to think. In fact, we even outsourced the share button to social media platforms, right? How do we deal with this kind of insidious manipulation? Let's start with tech first and data. Camille, you first. How should we deal with this? Because this is insidious manipulation that splinters, that changes what we think. And whether we take the nudge in the message or not, we still give data back to the machine that will keep coming. That feedback loop is continuous. How should we be thinking about it and dealing with it?
Yeah, it's a really good and a really tough question. I won't give a comprehensive answer because that's a 200 pages long in-depth examination. I will, however, put a few things on the table. The tech ecosystem and all its pieces is now extraordinarily complicated. Understanding when you open a product, maybe a social network or an app that you're using to read the news, understanding which pieces of content come to you and how. What is the role of machine learning in this curation? Which retail space on your screen has been leased to whom and by whom is now a very, very complicated endeavor, right? The online ad tech ecosystem is extraordinarily complicated. The different ways in which machine learning is and is not integrated in the end product, is trained and or refined and or tamed is also difficult. And so I think my first answer is we need transparency and accountability that unfortunately require quite a hard degree of expertise, right? Having people, as Craig said, like on this beat, able to investigate, okay, this is how you end up with crazy ads that really shouldn't be there. Let me impact this insane system of how it got there and let me go and get accountability on what happened. Similarly, on machine learning, there's a lot of, or at least I have a lot of hope for adversarial tinkering of those machine learning systems. A lot of great researchers and journalists have partnered to look at those systems from the outside and say, hey, here, systematically, we get a bad outcome that's either racist or sexist or problematic in any other way. And I want to make sure we can continue encouraging people tinkering from the outside to get accountability and transparency. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of change, don't need to happen around this. I'm French, so like in a very classic and boring way, I do believe in regulation. I think that regulation also has a role here, but I think, we're going to continue to need the type of transparency and accountability that journalism here really has brought and will continue bringing in these systems that often are really complex.
Craig, journalism demands accountability we demand accountability of governance. We also demand accountability of tech. You've started doing that. So how do you grapple with this, that it has come to this point of behavior modification? Do you agree, disagree, right? I mean, how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these systems are built to appeal to a lot of our, cognitive functions, biases that all humans have. They can exploit them and they can accentuate them. And I think that's really true. And I think that aspect of how these technologies are actually impacting us and changing our behaviors, I mean, that is a rich and really interesting area to really look at. And one of the, I think, the frustrations of trying to report on that area is that this is all still so relatively new that we have to be careful about making assumptions about what the outcomes are and what it's going to look like in a few years from now. So for the journalists out there, I would say rich area for investigation, But please, like, be rooted, if you're looking at this kind of stuff, be rooted in good expertise that you can go from people, you know, the researchers and others who are living and breathing that stuff all day long. Now, whereas an area of this that is really natural for journalists is, of course, just investigating these companies as well. Like, I think organizations like The Markup are doing really interesting work trying to investigate algorithms. And that's a great area for people to do more work in, because it's not just about the content Facebook shows you. It's also about whether you can get a loan to buy a house, whether you're going to be predicted to be a criminal in some cases. And so this is stuff that really affects the everyday lives of people in increasing ways. But I also think, you know, there's still a lot of work and investigation about holding these massive companies accountable, because I mean, they're not just companies. You think about Facebook. I mean, this is an entity that transcends a simple for-profit corporation. It is global. It has more than 2 billion people interacting regularly with its products. It is an advertising system. It's an events organization system. It's on and on and on and on. And there is so much there. And it is not beholden to any one government or any one law anywhere. And that is just a massive, massive, huge story to do. So I think we in some cases, the technology and all those aspects are really interesting and important to look at. There is also just fundamental accountability and helping us understand the behavior of these unprecedented entities that are impacting the daily lives of people all around the world. I mean, that is a rich and meaty story to dig into, and the natural kind of thing that journalists are good at.
No, I want to come back to you, but Claire, please chime in on this one. How do you look at this? I mean, this kind of incessant feedback loop that changes our behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I just link it back to the media literacy part, which is, have we taught people how algorithms work? And to Camille's point, it's so complex, yet affects absolutely everybody. And, you know, there are many of us know this. We have friends who still think that they see everything on Facebook that everybody has posted. And let's have a moment to stop and discuss the Social Dilemma documentary, which, you know, the nerds on this call would have some things to say about it. Has it meant almost everybody else I know on the world be like, okay, I've got to talk to you about the Social Dilemma? And it's because they, for the first time, like, I can't believe that I get targeted in that way. And I think it's just a massive case for, to Craig's point, there's many of us who now work in this field, but what we have failed to do is really make our work accessible, I think, to large populations, to say this affects you and this is what it means to you, your family and your community. And that documentary did that. So I think you're absolutely right to bring it up, Maria. We don't talk enough about the machines underneath this, and by not talking about it, it means that people don't understand how they're seeing what they're seeing.
So our translators are saying all of us have to slow down so they catch up with us. But Craig, I'm going to pick up from what you said. Shoshana Zuboff, the Harvard professor who wrote Surveillance Capitalism, actually goes as far as saying, it reminds me of the Minority Report. She said that, look, like the slave trade was outlawed, this type of manipulation should not be allowed. And I guess when you talk about investigations into these giant companies that have now determined what our world is going to look like, because information is power, right? How should we be thinking about this? Because there's so much to grapple with. How do you handle that?
Well, I mean, for me, I tend to be really interested, for example, in the advertising side of things. And I think that this is an area where there's room for a lot more reporting on this, because everybody's very focused on, you know, false and misleading information and online influence operations on these platforms. But at the end of the day, Facebook and Google make their money from advertising. And I don't think that their businesses and the operations of those aspects have been investigated enough. And if we talk about manipulation, that is where the fine micro-targeting exists. That is where the calls to action that get you to hand over your credit card, all of those kinds of things exist. And I think it is a criminally undercovered area. We don't know enough about the operation of these systems, but also about, you know, the revenue and the makeup of that revenue. And it's not just Facebook and Google. The digital advertising ecosystem is, to be completely frank, and I apologize for the translators to find a word for this in their own language, it's a gigantic, disgusting pig pile of corruption and criminality. And as a journalist, if that is the case, the number of stories that you can get out of that is massive. I mean, I've done a lot of investigations into ad fraud, but I got to tell you, it's really hard because you got to, first of all, get up to speed on programmatic advertising and targeted advertising. That's like, you know, I'm still learning. And then also it's really complicated to explain it to people. And so my editors all the time are being like, oh God, are you going to work on another ad fraud story, Craig? Seriously? And yet we're talking about a criminal industry, ad fraud, that is approaching the global drug trade in the amount of money stolen every year. And nobody is writing about it. So that's my invitation for everyone, is to pay more attention to that area. I think there's so many great stories to be done, and it's just not being looked at. And you know, the election ads are such a big focus right now. It's important to look at those, but there is so much more going on in these areas.
I think we only have a few minutes before I hand it over to Eunice, but you know, so I'll take your ad fraud, but you know, what about, I think that the advertising today is not the advertising of news organizations. Before, you would buy ad, whether it's in print or television or radio, here it is, right? It's not custom. It's not. Now with the programmatic ads, with custom audiences, with micro targeting, you can dump it in, and all of a sudden, you know, the social media platforms will pull out, you can put in email addresses, and all of a sudden you have a custom audience that is just like that. And of course, this has been targeting. That's also partly where the targeting hate speech has come in, right, Camille? I mean, those things that were used for advertising are now being used to manipulate for political power. This is the last question, and it's kind of a big question, I guess. You know, Camille, you've seen that. Craig, you've reported. Claire, you've seen the impact. Your thoughts on something like this, the advertising today versus back then, and how it is shifting voters and what they think, depending on what they're being targeted with.
I'll start with a sort of controversial statement. Yes, micro-targeting can be quite scary and poorly employed. But I think, to Craig's point, some of the deeper fraud, some of the deeper worries with this industry are actually more complicated than that. And I think that sometimes we look at the ad industry, the ad fraud, and we're like, okay, well, it has to be about micro-targeting. And if we remove micro-targeting, then it becomes a clean industry. And I think that that's a red herring, right? Like when you look at this industry, there's a lot on like the total lack of transparency, the number of hoops that people jump through between the person who's paying for an ad and where it ends up in placements, the fact that you have sanctioned entities and criminal enterprises who are using the systems, the fact that you can end up having a commercial that's running on a neo-Nazi website without any form of awareness of how did this happen. I think that yes, micro-targeting is part of why we have some of the issues with the current ad tech ecosystem, but there's a lot of more complex, difficult, really totally untransparent issues to also be investigated. Yeah, just broad comments, and now I'm gonna just totally punt it to Claire and Craig to continue unpacking this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Craig in because this is his thing, but I mean, I think some people might have seen the Channel 4 piece last week that talked about how Black voters in Wisconsin were being targeted with voter suppression messages. And there are some questions about how much we really know about what people saw. But I think I completely agree with Camille, but my frustration as somebody who researches in this space is that could be happening right now in a battleground state. And I do not feel with any confidence that I would be able to see that in real time through the Facebook transparency tools that they say are so wonderful. And so I think that is a terrifying idea that could be happening right now, and we won't know until after the election, once a lot of people have done a lot of digging, and that's terrifying.
When's Craig's editor, let him run their piece.
Craig.
I mean, look, the election ads issue is the forefront one related to this discussion right now. And to Claire's point, Facebook does have an archive that it says has all the political and issue ads that it has flagged as political and issue ads. But understand that it misses some, and understand that it will retroactively add some that it missed back into that database. So you may want to go back and keep checking on that. And the other tip I'll give to people on this, specifically for election ads, is some of the most powerful ad tools out there have been made for really skeezy, scammy marketers, okay? And so these are called spy tools. So if you were to Google, ad spy tools, you're going to come across a bunch of options. A lot of them offer like a free 30-day or 15-day trial. These are very expensive tools. They can cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars a month. But we got about 30 days, less than 30 days to the election. So I would encourage you to sign up for some spy tools and to test them out and to run some searches, because I can tell you personally, I published a story this week, and I found that story because I searched for ads about Uyghurs, the Muslim minority in China, in an ad tool. It identified an ad that was not labeled a political ad or an issues ad by Facebook, and that led me to a bogus news website and a fake page related to it. So check out the spy tools, do some searches in there, compare and contrast, and try to, as much as you can, as to Claire's point, try to get local on it. Because if I'm going to try and move people and have some bang for my buck and try to get away with something, I'm going to do local targeting, because the big national outlets searching these databases are going to ignore that. So those are some things that people could try.
And I'm supposed to hand it over to Eunice, but one last quick question, which is, for the work that you do you guys, have you gotten attacked? And if you have, how do you deal with it?
I feel like you should answer that question, Maria.
You already know. I talk about this way too much. I like hearing from you, from everyone else, because I think there's always a cost, right? So how do you deal with that? What is the cost, and how would you advise other journalists?
Camille is unmuted. Let her go.
No, I keep a little card on my office that says, "What would Maria do?" This is how I deal with this.
You do not, Camille. Camille, you've just, so what you may not know about Camille is that she actually has talked to the people who were IRA. I mean, she's done a lot of this work, much like journalists. But go, Camille, your latest ones. What happened to you with the new, after we take them down, they come up again, and please tell us.
I think we're all joking, Maria, but we're also very serious. I think that your experience in the face of these threats is something that we all think about all the time, and it does take people who are strong leaders like you to see that it's important not to back down in the face of threats. I think I don't want to speak for Claire and Craig, but I know a lot of people in the field experience that. And I guess, it goes back to what we're initially saying, the fact that disinformation gets incredibly politicized, that the conversation continues to be more and more polarized. We're going to continue, unfortunately, seeing that. On my end, it's true that our last report talked about a Russian operation targeting the far right. This operation maintained accounts on 2 social media platforms that are kind of like, safe harbor for distasteful speech. And they didn't really like being exposed in this way. And they made a bunch of unsavory and sexist comments, which again, I don't think is particularly surprising. I think, unfortunately, it's more of the texture that we live in this world, which I regret, but I don't think it's an exception here.
Yeah, I'll just say, so far, touch wood, I haven't had horrific levels of harassment at all. But what I think it means is that there is a chilling effect on speech. I know that I don't say things in certain places. I know that First Draft keeps a lot of stuff private because I'm trying to protect the staff. We get asked to do press requests around anti-vaxxer QAnon things, and I have to ask the staff if they're prepared to put themselves out there. That's the sad thing about all of this, which is, in order to do this work, it's just, we know it's happening. And yes, we have to carry on exposing this, but it does take a personal cost. And I do worry about younger members of the team, whether or not it's okay to put them out there like that. I'm making decisions for myself, but there's a whole host of things here, which I think we end up not saying as much as we should be, because we're trying to protect one another.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think we also tend to not, so I'll give a very specific example. Sometimes we decide that pieces of research that we want to put out are sensitive and will trigger some form of attack, and then we tend to sign them collectively. So we don't give people the opportunity to take credit for their work because we want to protect them. I think is the right thing to do. I also regret that that we need to, to do that. And I think that the people who do this work, finding the right balance for not only younger members of the team between like getting the credit they deserve and not being exposed to this type of thing is really difficult.
And Craig.
Well, I mean, I think, so my experience has been, I would say, pretty mild. And the reason for that is I'm a white man, right? Like women and people of color are getting way more harassment. Colleagues of mine who do similar coverage experience way more stuff than I do. I get anti-Semitic comments and things like that occasionally, but so I think that's a really important thing to point out here, is that it is disproportionate. It is unequal. It reflects a lot of inequalities of society. And so people who are already experiencing other kinds of difficulties are getting it even worse in this area. And so, that's the truth. That's the reality of it. And so for me, it's been a relatively mild experience. In other cases, we've had people who are the target of massive campaigns that people trying to, SIM swap and take their phone number away, people who are trying to hack their accounts. I mean, it can get extremely dangerous.
Okay. No, Eunice, there's so many questions for you. Why don't we ask Eunice to come in and ask what our audience has asked? Go ahead, Eunice.
Okay, let's see how much time we have left for these questions. I'll start with 2. So number 1, what are the top 3 tools you use to expose who is behind a campaign of disinformation? And maybe Craig can also name some of the ad spy tools he uses. And question number 2, how do journalists with few resources, often in rural areas, investigate or combat election disinformation?
I mean, okay, so I'll name a few. Obviously, on the slides there are a few there for. Okay, so if the question was who's behind it, so if we're dealing with the website, you want to try and look at who is information. Now, if they're reasonably smart, they've paid to make it private, but sometimes you get lucky. So some of the free tools are domain big data and whoisology. More advanced threat intelligence tools like domain tools are extremely powerful and can help you with connecting IPs and other kinds of more technical information. Aside from that, I mean, often with websites, again, they might be using Google Analytics or Google AdSense if they have ads. And so you can often track trackers that are on one website and maybe on others. So what happens is somebody might run a network of websites. They might have the same analytics code on all of them, but they've paid for privacy on, let's say, 8 of the 9 websites because the 9th is their personal website or something like that. And that's how you can sort of connect them together. And in the verification handbook, we walk through that in terms of websites. So those, a couple of elements there. And there's a great tool called builtwith.com that will actually show you some of these trackers and codes on websites. For ad spy tools, there's one called Ad Spy, believe it or not. There's another one called Big Spy. But the one that I'll recommend you also look at is visto.il, and I will drop the link in the chat there. This is one that I used recently. It has a pretty good free offering. It limits some of your searches, but visto.il, the link I will drop in, is an ad spy tool that you may be able to get better bang for no buck.
I get to jump in quickly because obviously Craig's talked about great tools, but I just want to emphasize in terms of finding this stuff, it comes down to having really excellent keywords. And in order to have those keywords, you need to think about the different ways that different communities use different words around the same issue. And so I would always, when we train journalists, spend more time thinking about keywords and then turn them into Boolean search queries, have spreadsheets of keywords that shift as language changes, build up networks to Craig's point. This is time-consuming stuff, but you want lists of accounts and people, and that comes from searching and understanding what these communities are saying. Because if I'm a bad actor, I'm trying to infiltrate those communities, sound like I know what I'm talking about. And so a lot of the first thing I'd say is, before you get to kind of Craig Silverman levels, is just get into these spaces and understand them. And that comes down to understanding the language that people are using.
I will add that sometimes it's worth going through the entire list, right? Taking Craig's resources and just going systematically through, okay, where have they slipped? Is there one domain that they forgot to pay for privacy on? Is there just like one thing that simply has their name on it? Or, you know, like which part of their operation did they forgot to tie up? I will say sometimes we've seen really sophisticated actors slip in bizarre ways. In the last investigation we did, we worked on a Russian military network. One of the website was simply registered to the Far Eastern Military District of the GRU. We looked at it and was like, oh wow, that's so these things happen once in a while, which is why, again, it's worth going through all of them systematically, which is time consuming.
Well, like the military officer that you found in the Philippines, sorry, that was DFR Labs. Sorry, Graphika did the Chinese. Go ahead, Eunice, other questions?
Yes, two more questions. Are there tools or tips to help determine at what point a certain disinformation narrative that has been brewing in online private chats makes the jump into the offline world and can potentially cause harm and pose a real threat? And question number two, this one's for Maria. How did Rappler analyze the disinformation campaign against it?
I can quickly answer that one. You know, in order for us to figure out how to act, we needed to understand how we were being attacked. So we took it in two directions. The first was to take the information on social media, this would be the content, the posts, and take it, take it as data, dump it into NLP, natural language processing, and take out the clusters of the messaging. And then the second was to look at the networks of disinformation, because these networks, like, and this comes from fact checking. If you're a fact checker, I tend to take a look at, you know, which networks are spreading that. Marcos, for example, historical revisionism, or the attacks, the network that was taken down September 22, which Camille and Graphika analyzed, came from China, but it first attacked Taiwan. Indonesia, was successful in the Philippines. Camille pointed out, attacked me and Rappler, and then started making AI photos of fake accounts for the US elections. So these are all come together. But those two ways, I think you can use natural language processing if you've got folks who can do that, because you can take the social media posts and then you can do clusters of topics and then which networks are spreading those.
I'll talk a little bit about the closed messaging apps, because I think it's really important that they're part of the conversation. And the challenge here for journalists and researchers is, of course, because they're encrypted, there is no easy way to monitor what's in them. And then when you find it, to understand how many other people may have seen them. So, I mean, there's three ways to do that. You can either set up a tip line, but that tends to mean that the people that send you stuff are the people who are less likely to see it in the first place. Or you can, for example, look for short codes. So if I create a WhatsApp group and I want to add Craig, I will send him a link that says go to chat.whatsapp.com/12345. So I can look for those short codes online, search for them, and then set up like automatic processes for scraping that content. The ethical question is, should we be doing that? I mean, sometimes you hear research say, well, I'm scraping public WhatsApp groups. Well, I would argue that none of them are public. Those groups have people's telephone numbers. They don't necessarily think that they're public groups. But some people would argue that we should be in these spaces so we understand what's happening. The third, which is the middle ground, which is you find some of these groups and you just lurk in them and you just quietly sit there. Do you put your hand up and say, hello, I'm a journalist or I'm a researcher? But the question is an excellent one, which is increasingly this kind of content is spreading in closed spaces and then it jumps, but we don't know at what point it jumps. And the bigger question here, so for example, around the US election, we're trying to monitor WhatsApp groups that, for example, in Latinx communities in the US, WhatsApp is very highly used. If I'm trying to push a voter suppression campaign, I'm going to spend some time in those spaces and I'm going to push that kind of content. But is it ethical for us to be in those spaces? Or if there was a voter suppression campaign and we saw it, would I go to Craig and be like, hey, Craig, here's a BuzzFeed story for you to write. Should Craig be writing about that? Or should I go to a local Spanish community media outfit and say, actually, there's something that seems to be bubbling on WhatsApp, but we don't know how many people are seeing the rumor? Because then if you report on it, you're either helping people go, oh, there's a rumor circulating, I should be careful, or, oh my God, there's a rumor that ICE is going to be at the polls and going to arrest me if I vote. I mean, there's so much here that's problematic. At least with Facebook, we can be like, okay, this rumor is everywhere. It's all over Instagram. It's all over Facebook. It's a problem. There's no way of knowing that level of spread. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more rumors circulating in closed messaging apps in the US. This has been the case. Those of you on this call from places like India and Brazil and the Philippines, like, yeah, welcome to the party, America. But in the American context, this feels new, but it's a real challenge ethically and methodologically about how we do it and whether we do it.
Any other? Go ahead, Eunice.
I think we missed the question just now. Any tips for journalists in smaller media outlets with few resources to investigate election disinformation? Any tips on that?
I mean, I'll say a couple of things. You know, one of the disadvantages you have is obviously you don't have a lot of resources, and you know your newsroom probably hasn't offered you training in this particular area. But the good news is you're here in this panel, and there's lots of resources that you now have. And the other piece of good news is that you have a smaller kind of world to think about. You have a local area. And if you are a local journalist in that area, you know people, you have connections, and they know you. And so one of the most basic things that you could do is you can, start talking to the people you know. And I don't mean, like prominent sources. I mean, who are your friends on Facebook? Who are your friends on Instagram? Who are your friends in all these platforms? Do you have local WhatsApp groups or with your friends? And just put the word out among them that, if they see anything a bit strange related to the election or related to voting, you would love to know about it. So start spreading that word a little bit. And then the second piece is, again, because you've got a local area, I would start looking for Facebook groups about your local area. Join tons of Facebook groups, buy and sell groups, parents groups, because the people who are trying to seed this stuff, they're not going to create like a disinformation group. They're going to go and they're going to spam it into lots of the local groups about lots of different topics. So you're going to need to get in lots of groups. You're going to need to start monitoring and checking those, talking to people you know. If you think WhatsApp is popular in parts of the community, think about what Claire said, like, are there groups that you might be able to join? Be transparent with them. Don't hide yourself in there. Say you're a journalist, make some connections. And then I would also suggest that you try and get a CrowdTangle account, contacting the people at CrowdTangle, because then you can actually monitor public groups, public Facebook pages really easily. So, those are a few things I would say. And I guess the last piece is, maybe a Twitter list where you're searching, setting up some keywords related to election and your location, and just start monitoring based on keywords there would potentially be a helpful thing as well.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, yesterday we saw some stuff coming out of Pennsylvania of videos about ballots. Because I mean, Maria, you started and said we're 23 days out. I mean, people are already voting. So in many ways, there are people trying to push this narrative that the election cannot be trusted. It's all over the place. So to Craig's point, if you start searching for keywords related to ballots, voting, you'll be surprised what you're seeing. Already now. It's not just November 3rd.
Okay, I think we might have time for one more question. Someone asked, what are the biggest technical challenges that you guys run into these days while investigating this information? If you could ask for a new tool to be developed, what would be most useful? Camille, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start and sort of continue the thread that we were on. I worry a lot about DMs and private communications when we think about sophisticated campaigns, and I'll tell you why. A lot of the times, for instance, on the campaigns that we work on that are state-sponsored, right, the Russia, the China, the Iran, people think that it's just a bunch of posts on Facebook or just posts on Twitter, but that's actually not true. A lot of the targeting of unwitting participants a lot of manipulating the journalists. All this also happens on DMs and in private messages. We never really talk about this. It's kind of the unacknowledged part of the space. It's a lot of data that nobody's ever seen, sometimes for really good reasons, right? Those are private messages. But as a result, we don't have a lot of sophistication on understanding how those sophisticated actors target activists, target journalists. And every time I speak with people who've been personally targeted, what I learn is huge. It's really interesting in terms of techniques and tactics. You'll learn new things about how these manipulations are getting done and how insidious they are. And there's new things that are come to light about the timeline. And that's, for me, is a big blind spot that we have when we study these operations. Again, like this idea that they're all just spreading, you know, on platforms, whereas also they're just doing things that are much more targeted and personal. I don't know what tool could solve this. I think that perhaps people, you know, could contribute things that are well marked to remove their own sort of, you know, personal information for investigation, and then can share it in this way. I will say in general, organizing tip lines for collective examination is difficult but important. There's a project that we're part of that we're very happy with. It's the Electoral Integrity Partnership with our colleagues at Stanford, at University of Washington, and at DFR Lab. This is kind of what we're doing. It's a giant tip line of people reporting bits and pieces that sound odd to them that we're able to take on the other side and quickly investigate and reply on. So that's another system that I think is important when you're so close to the election and you need to do sort of collective work while making sure that nobody's sort of replicating what everybody else is doing.
Craig or Claire?
Oh, I mean, I'll just say, those of us who've been doing this for a while, in the last 10 years, as platforms have kind of cracked down on privacy, which is good on one hand, it's made it much harder to do the work that we want to do around verification. So over the weekend, you might have seen that, you know, Trump and Ivanka put out 2 different images, and a reporter figured out that the EXIF data showed that those 2 images had only been taken 10 minutes apart. And I was like, oh, because that data gets stripped out of social networks. You know, it's very difficult for us to do, you know, even with the European GDPR, it's now much harder to see, you know, who's registered a website. So I think it's difficult to come down on one side because privacy is a good thing, but it's increasingly hard for us to do the jobs that we do. And to Craig's point, the most powerful tool we have is CrowdTangle, and it's owned by Facebook. I mean, we just need, you know, independent tools that are not designed for marketeers. But yeah, we do need more tools, but I feel like we have this conversation all the time, and, you know, we want a video reverse image search. I mean, there's so many things that we want, and you know, it feels like we actually have fewer tools now.
Let me just, so I think that we are at that tail end. We're at the end, we're over. So first, before we close, you know, let me thank GIJN. I wish we were all together in the same place, and the audience for coming and joining us tonight. And of course, we have to give a virtual clap, great big hugs to our 3 experts, Camille, Craig, and Claire. And now also the GIJN election guide. Check it out, right? Please check that out, GIJN's election watchdog alerts on Twitter. GIJN Election Watchdog, and in Spanish at #GIJN Lupa Electoral. And please join us for the next webinar of GIJN, same time, Thursday, October 22. It's on investigating police violence. GIJN is doing that in partnership with the African Investigative Journalism Conference. It is so good to see you all again. And there's so many people watching who I would love to say hi, but you know, it is a few days, it's less than a month before elections. Guys, you in the States, please go fix it. And then for the rest of us, our work is cut out for us. Journalists in general have been doing our jobs. You know, we now need tech to come in a lot more, and civil society to push it forward. For GIJN. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us.